Let's do
Okay,
it.
thanks everyone for joining us today for, I think this is the sixth webinar in a series of zoning code update meetings that we'll be doing virtually. Today's is for the commercial zone, the C zone, which includes Bellevue Avenue. We do have a very full agenda today, so we're going to get rolling as other folks continue to join. But as Mel said earlier, for those who were on, you can always go to menti.com at any time during this meeting and use the code at the top of your screen, which will stay there. And we've got a QR code coming up as we do some introductions after agenda review. There also is a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen that you can use if the Menti's giving you trouble. But agenda today, we're going to spend about 15 minutes looking at the big picture, talking about, what zoning is, why we're updating the code, and the process that is supporting it, which we are at the very early stages of. Then we're going to dive into some details on the C zone, look at what exists today, what is potentially being considered for changes in the future. We want to reserve at least 20 minutes for your questions, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time we have. You can enter them in any point during the presentation in that Q&A function. You can also, as we get to the end of the meeting, we'll open the Q&A portion and you can raise your hand and ask your questions. And then we will be sending you a follow-up survey to everyone who's attending today. So you'll have some time to process everything we present and go a little bit more granular into the specifics of the C zone or any of the other zones that we are doing. So with that, we'll go to our instruction slide for the Menti. And this QR code is a real easy way to do it on your phone and follow along that way. Or you can put menti.com in your browser and use this code. There'll be some open-ended and some polling questions. And then you've always got that Q&A button as an option as well. So while everybody gets onto the Menti, let's go ahead and do some quick introductions for the team. I'm Miles Graham, and I've been moderating not only meetings like this for the Community Compass, but this series of webinars. And I'm joined by Mel and some other town staff.
Thanks, Miles. I'm Mel Yema, the town's Community Development Director. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to Jesse.
Thanks, Mel. I'm Jessie Early. I'm the senior planner here at the town of Crested Butte. I'll turn it over to Caitlin.
Sorry about that. My name is Caitlin Archambault. I am a planner with the town. I'm going to be in the background here, but really excited to be here with you all. Thanks for joining. And I'll let Dara introduce herself.
Okay, yeah, unmuted. Dara McDonald, town manager, still learning how to use Zoom.
Thanks, Tara. And so let's jump right into it. What we have here is a little ice-breaking question, also a way to get us warmed up on the Mentimeter. And it looks like I think everyone on the meeting has already signed into the Menti, so you should be getting a prompt. So we want to know in a single word, what do you love most about the C zone? Variety, one of my favorite things about the C zone. And on that theme, multi-use. And some of the themes we've been hearing from the previous 5 webinars we've done are location. There's not a bad zone in Crested Butte. The location is amazing no matter where you are. And same can be said for the people in the community. So those have been our themes. We love the multi-use and variety in the C zone. It's a great way to start the meeting. So let's dive right into it. And now that we've got our webinar up, it looks like we had one more late addition option, open lots for lots of storage and functional. Excellent. That is awesome. And I'll flip it to Mel to take us through the process.
Awesome. So let's start with the big picture. Why are we updating the zoning code and how are we going about it? So we love Crested Butte and our small town charm and sense of community, but our community faces a lot of challenges, and we have been for a while now. A lot of change has been happening to us and around us for a long time and still is. And in a lot of ways, we've been reacting really incrementally to that change. A lot of growth is happening within the town and especially surrounding the town right now. The town itself is landlocked and limited in development potential. And that high demand and interest with limited availability has really created a market that's out of balance, where a lot of free market development is catering to amenities, tourism, luxury uses, while community needs, housing that people that live and work here can afford, or childcare or trades or those sorts of everyday needs are being publicly subsidized, or some of those are and have been for a long time now. And that bifurcation has resulted in a lot of our community livability and affordability and the erosion of that. So why update the code? Now is really the time to be more proactive and identify and work towards the future our community wants. How can we better guide growth to meet those community needs? Let's be really strategic about the remaining development potential in Crested Butte and try to bring some balance back into the market through a mix of regulations and incentives. And in general, let's really just look at making our zoning code much clearer, easier to use, and better aligned with our community values. So this isn't a project that we're starting overnight. Updating our code and doing this work takes a lot of work and commitment, and a lot of work and listening and learning from the community. And this really starts back in 2021 with the Community Compass, where we first started to say, hey, a lot of change is happening and it's maybe not really reflecting where a community wants to go. So let's start at that 10,000 foot level and really identify what are our shared values and goals and where do we want to go as a community. So that's what we did with the first step of the Community Compass. From there, how do we go about working towards our goals? What are our more specific plans and strategy when it comes to transportation mobility, historic preservation, the community plan, our future land use vision, climate action, and all of those things that our community says it cares about? And then let those strategies directly influence and have our regulations and programs be a reflection of those. So our zoning and subdivision code, our building code, our housing strategy, we want those all to tie back to those values and goals of the community, because at the end of the day, the next capital improvement project you see, the park renovation, the new development, we want that to directly tie back to those shared values and goals of the Crested Butte community. So the Community Compass, that's where we started. All it identified was our 4 key goals, or 4 key shared values as a community of being authentic, connected, accountable, and bold. 7 guiding goals to prioritize the town council's work and decision-making over the next 5 years, as you can see here, and a decision-making framework and a shared commitment of working with the community as we work through achieving these goals. And as you can see, a lot of these goals are really interconnected, but also can conflict with one another. So for example, how do we accommodate growth in a way that maintains our rural feel with enabling people who live and work here to thrive? There could be a lot of opportunity between those two, but they could also really conflict with one another. So we set out to do the community plan to really look at the interplay between those two goals. The community plan was all about looking at our future land use vision with the goal of improving the livability, functionality, and sense of community in Crested Butte by leveraging the town's development regulations to thoughtfully guide free market investment in community serving housing and spaces for businesses and nonprofits. This was not our new 5-year housing plan. What housing is the town going to build? This was all about looking at our development regulations to see how can we get the free market to be a better player and partner with the town to meet these goals of the community. And it had 2 primary objectives. Number 1, expand, diversify, and distribute community serving housing. This is something the town's been at for decades now, and it's exciting to say 1/4 of our housing stock is deed restricted in some form to either be a long-term rental, owner occupied, workforce requirement, or those sorts of things. And it's really cool thing of all the ADUs and units and commercial buildings and things spread out across the town that have really distributed that community need. But we know it's never enough, and we still have a big challenge there. So the community plan really looked at how can we rethink incentives and flexibility to meet that objective. It also introduced a new objective around facilitating, creating, and preserving community serving spaces. When you think of your quality of life in Crested Butte and your cost of living here, housing is one piece of the pie, but what about access to everyday services and needs and businesses, maybe an affordable place to grab lunch, access to trades, access to childcare and those sorts of things that we might be starting to lose some of those, or they've become affordable in the community. So that's a journey we're just starting with this plan. So the community plan looked at different areas of town and identified different land use visions for different areas and recommended different tools and incentives in different areas in exchange for community serving housing and spaces. So we're going to go into what some of those could look like in the zoning code today. And for Bellevue, a big focus and vision for the community plan was to preserve and grow more community serving commercial in this area. The community plan identified the vision and recommended the tools, but now we need to make it happen and implement it. So starting with the zoning code update, let's enable that vision to happen. Let's make sure our regulations are inhibiting those visions to come to life and actually support them. At the same time, we recognize the development framework is only one piece. We also need to look at a strategy around housing and community spaces. Are there programs? Are there financial incentives? Are there projects to complement the code to really help us implement that vision? At the same time, before the community plan, we adopted our first ever historic preservation plan, which identified a new vision around historic preservation and design standards that will directly lead into an update of the design standards, which we know complement the zoning code. We'll talk about today what the zoning code covers, what the design standards cover, and how those work together. And we'll set the stage of some of the anticipated changes coming for that too. So how are we going to update the code? Since the community plan was adopted in July, we spent a lot of work so far just doing a lot of internal review and preparation, recognizing our code has never had a wholesale update, I think, since it was first adopted back in the 70s. So thinking about modernizing definitions, cleaning up inconsistencies, doing all that work and starting to look at where can those pieces and recommendations from the community plan best fit in. And then we've had a lot of work sessions so far with BOZAR, the Board of Zoning and Architectural Review, to understand what's working well, what's not working well, what could be improved. Because in addition to updating just the code itself, we're also going to be really updating our development review processes to make sure the process is also a good reflection of our values and is easy to understand, simple to participate in. Now we're in the outreach phase, so we're doing all of these code webinars. I'm excited to say we're on number 6 out of 7. So our last one is next week. If you have been participating, I know some of you on here have been at a lot of them. Thank you so much. And if you haven't, all of the recordings are available on the town's website. And we have an open survey. And these webinars are all about introducing the process, going over our first draft of considerations of some things, some changes we might be looking at, and then getting your feedback to improve it. And that's what the third phase will be all about, is multiple drafts, multiple refinements using your feedback, feedback from the council, feedback from BOZAR. If you participated in the Compass, we rewrote it 7 times, and the community plan, we still rewrote twice, a little less than 7. But we're going to keep refining the zoning code with your feedback to make sure we get to a place that the community is comfortable with. So we would love to hear from you. Just multiple choice question. What are your preferred ways to engage in the zoning code update? Knowing there's a lot more process and engagement to come. What are the best ways to reach you, from webinars, surveys, council, BOZAR meetings, open houses, or hey, can we get more creative?
And as Mel said, we are at the beginning of this process, as was shown in that timeline. But Heather just pointed out in the timeline, we have great catch on the years.
Yes.
That should be 25 into 2026. So we're not a year behind. We're just at the beginning of that process. So great catch.
Thank you, Heather. Apologies about that.
And like Mel said, this is the beginning of the process. So we're going to be looking for a lot of different ways to engage through more of these webinars, the survey, council meetings, of course, looking at open houses. And one of the things we've heard from other webinars is that some of that targeted one-on-one outreach is really important too. So that's definitely something that we'll be factoring in as we move forward.
Awesome. So what's guiding this process? Back in October, we held a joint work session with council and BOZAR to see if we could come to alignment on what are those key strategies to guide the code update. So as we look through and looked at inconsistencies and look at new things and changes, How can these be a rubric to say, okay, these changes we should consider because they hit all of these strategies? These were the 5 that we found really good alignment of, and it's essentially taking all of those different, the historic preservation plan, the community plan, the climate action plan, the transportation plan, essentially the compass, and what's the like executive summary of that, of where we want our zoning code to go. So number 1, let's look at simplifying the code. How do we make sure it's really clear, easy to understand, consistent, and that it really is a reflection of our values? Number 2, retain our small town feel. How do we really retain the scale and feel of our buildings that make Crested Butte, and that's great small town vibe that we love, but then also recognize a lot of that small town feel also comes in the lifestyle and knowing your neighbors and walking down the street and knowing people. How does that play into this too? Number 3, strengthen historic preservation. As we'll set the stage for today, the historic preservation plan calls for a different approach to preservation going forward, but how do we make sure we strengthen that approach and don't lose out on all that incredible historic preservation work we've done to date? Number 4, integrate land use with transportation and climate action. How do we update our land uses and make sure our code enables more people to live closer to where they work? So there's more options to not have to live so far away, not have to commute in, and make sure it's really well integrated. And then lastly, link zoning to community benefits. How do we really implement those incentives identified in the community plan to make sure any flexibility, any incentives, any sort of changes or things really are resulting in those needs of community serving housing and community serving spaces? So knowing we're just introducing these strategies to you right now, we'd love to hear, do you have an initial reaction? Are some of them more important to you than others? Do some of them stand out? It's okay to hit that, I'd like to think about this more. This is a question in the survey that, so you can definitely keep thinking about it, but we would just love to hear some of these strategies standing out to you.
And Mel, some of the early returns look like the simplification and maintaining our small town feel and linking zoning directly to community benefits are the prioritization, and retaining our character and small town feel and simplification of the code are pulling ahead.
Awesome. We'll just give a couple more seconds if folks want to add in. And then I think I've done enough talking. I'll turn it over to the rest of the team as we get more into the details. Awesome. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks all. Looks like we had some more additions into simplification and retaining what makes Crested Butte Crested Butte. So on the next slide, we've got one more poll before we dive into the details. And we just want to take your temperature going into all of the potential draft changes that are going to be presented. How familiar do you feel with the town's current zoning? And that could be anywhere on the continuum from what the heck is zoning? Is it some sort of regulation, all the way to I'm an expert. I not only follow the town's zoning, but I follow zoning rules and trends nationally, or somewhere in between, which is, whatever Beaux-Arts requires and knowing the rules of my own zone. And so this is exactly why we want to unpack the next section really thoughtfully, looking at some key categories, what exists today, what some potential changes could look like, knowing that we are in the very early stages of drafting these proposed changes, and hearing from you and leveraging your expertise is going to be something that we draw upon throughout this process. And with that, I think we'll move into the next slide, and I'll pass it over to Jesse.
Thanks so much, Miles. So thanks for answering that question. And I see most of you on here. Some of you have been on the previous webinars, so bear with me. We do want to give a little overview of zoning, though, for those not as familiar with some of you that are way more familiar. So zoning is basically the way a city or town divides its land into different areas called zones to control how property can be used and developed. Each zone has its own rules that are outlined on the screen here. So those are things like land use, what type of use is allowed on that property, the density of the buildings, so the floor area ratio, and how we calculate that, which we'll talk about a little more later, the fit of those buildings, so parking, the lot measurements and the building measurements, setbacks, those kind of things, and then other regulations like demolition, floodplain, PUD, all come together. The main goal of zoning is basically to make sure that the land is used in a way that's safe, organized, and supports the community's overall plan for growth. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, thinking about the zoning code as one piece, their development is basically regulated by multiple factors that work together to ensure that projects are safe, like I mentioned, appropriate and consistent with the community's goals. In our town's case, we have the zoning code like we just talked about, but we also have the design standards, which tell about how the building should look and the mass scale and form, and then historic preservation requirements. Then there are other things that come into play, like building codes and also subdivision regulations. And so those all layer together, and those layers of regulation shape how the development happens within our town. And this basically balances private property rights with public safety and the community's vision. And these development review processes are evaluated as part of each application that we get. Next slide, please. So when we think about all those things in our minds, our task with this update for the zoning update is to ensure that these processes are easier to understand and more efficient. So for example, are there things that we could do, certain projects, for instance, that could be reviewed administratively rather than all projects going forward to the full Board of Zoning and Architectural Review, or BOZAR, for review. And so those projects would check the boxes to make sure that they meet our community's goals. And then more difficult projects, those could be reserved for the board. And so making sure that we save their energy for the difficult projects or the projects that might have more public engagement, for instance.
And as we get more into the details, just to give some context on zoning, any changes being considered and that would eventually be adopted would influence development going forward. So it wouldn't come in and say, you know, have to retroactively change this on your property. It would only apply going forward. And it's good to recognize the context of Crested Butte and that we are pretty built out and we do have strong demolition regulations. And talking about the C-zone, as you can see on the map here, there is some vacant property and redevelopment could be possible. But given our scale and our pace of development in a small town like ours, a lot of the changes that we're looking at will likely be really slow and incremental, but could have an influence in the long term. So let's dive into the C-zone. The general intent of the C-zone is the commercial and light industrial core of the town with secondary institutional and housing uses allowed. And that's not an intent that this code update is really looking at changing, and that the community plan really identified how do we really make sure Bellevue remains that commercial core, and can we try to incentivize and facilitate more community serving commercial in this area, while trying to allow more housing and as a secondary use as well, knowing those are both needs. So I want to introduce on the left of the slide the first draft of an updated zoning map. None of the boundaries of the C-zone, which is shown in purple here, are proposed to change, but there are a couple other tweaks on the zoning map that I'd like to go over, and that relates to the historic preservation plan and the updated design guidelines. So currently under today's code, the entire town boundary is the town's local historic district, meaning that anything built within the town boundary has to be built to look like it came from the mining era of the town's history. That has been fantastic, but the historic preservation plan really called for, hey, we're kind of freezing our history in time, and how do we continue to showcase and celebrate the different periods of our town's history, especially looking at our evolution from a mining town into a ski and recreation focused town, and then knowing community and design continues to evolve over time, and how do we not preclude what's today's era going forward. So what it does is look at changing the boundary and doing 2 overlay zones for the historic districts. So number 1 would be our National Historic District. That mining area period of significance would become an overlay zone of this red boundary here. So it actually wouldn't influence the C zone on Bellevue. But it's a buffer around our National Historic Core. And what that would do is say if you fall within this overlay zone, you would reference this chapter of the design standards around the mining era of our history, essentially what we do today. It then introduces a new period of significance called the early recreation era, which are buildings that were built that have architectural significance from the town's transition into a ski and recreation town. So think like mid 60s to mid 80s. That would become another overlay zone over the town, but it would be more of a salt and pepper district, so different from the mining era. What's shaded, all the parcels that are shaded on the map right now are all of the buildings in the town that were built in that period. We're currently doing a survey to better understand architectural significance and integrity of those. If your property falls in within that period, you've received a letter, and we'll be doing lots of community engagement. And based on that survey and your feedback, that will be narrowed down into another overlay zone for that era. Then outside of those 2 overlay zones, you would just have standard design standards around mass, scale, and form, but more architectural flexibility around roof forms, windows, different styles, so we can reflect the evolving style of our community. So some other update focus areas that we're going to hit on today is that we're going to look at improving uses and definitions. That's something we're doing across the board in all zones to modernize things and reduce inconsistencies, but really for Bellevue, maintain that commercial focus. We're going to talk about looking at potentially right sizing parking requirements. We're going to look at also requirements for a potential sidewalk or streetscape for pedestrian friendliness. Do we start to think about building arrangements and is parking more off the back to over time set up Bellevue to be a little more pedestrian friendly? And then looking at embedding some incentives within our code, including exploring a 4th story allowance in exchange for deed restricted commercial space and or housing. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about. So before we go into each provision though, we want to hear what challenges are you experiencing in the Bellevue area? Some things we've heard from some other zones to date have been snow storage, parking, affordability, but we want to hear from you. Every zone is unique. What are some challenges that you're experiencing?
Mel and Jesse, thanks so much for that detailed overview. And while we get some responses going, one other thing we've heard, particularly as it relates to the last 2 webinars we did in some of the business zones in Elk and 6th, is that there is some intensity of use from those zones that spills over and is felt in adjacent zones. So that's another theme we've heard, and we'll continue the trend of parking and snow storage, the pedestrian access and accessibility and safety. I think of the pedestrian piece is a good one that is pretty unique to what we've heard for the C zone. We didn't hear that as much in some of the other neighborhoods.
Good response so far.
More parking and snow storage and variety of services. So that's where these trade-offs come up, just like we love the functionality and the multi-use variety of this zone, that also can present some challenges.
Awesome. And architectural transitions between zones, that's great. And I would definitely encourage you to join us for the design standards kickoff next week, which we'll hit on at the end.
Okay, so I'm going to hop into the land uses. Many of our zone districts have a long list of uses like this one, the C zone. Our current list of uses is on the left and the proposed list of uses is on the right. We have both permitted and conditional uses. Permitted means that they can be done by right with no review process. And then conditional means that some level of review is required. And for our town, that currently means that project would go to Bozar for a conditional use. So I'm going to quickly try and go over the changes because I know this is a lot to look at here on the screen. So basically what we're keeping in this zone district is public transit stops, public recreation trails, office uses, commercial kitchen catering use, commercial storage, dealerships, vehicle rental, vet clinic, hospital, laundry, dry cleaning, builder supply yards, contractors like plumbers, electricians, nurseries and greenhouses, and micro distilleries. These would all be made to be permitted uses rather than conditional uses. Some exist as permitted uses right now, but just to overview those. Dwelling uses, congregate housing, public transit facilities, auto-related uses, marijuana uses, and light industrial would all be conditional uses. And then we'd clean up things like office and storage uses. Right now, there are multiple different uses given in the zone district, but we thought we could consolidate those and better outline what does that mean in the definition section rather than in the use within the zone district. Residential units are currently called a couple of different things within the zone district as well. So those would be then called dwelling units rather than employee dwelling or residential units. We would add local serving retail establishments, as Mel outlined earlier. And then natural medicine uses would be a conditional use within the zone, which is a new addition, fairly new addition based upon a Colorado statute that was added last year. So the things that would be removed would be garages, amusement, recreation, accessory buildings, rental, repair, and wholesaling, parking areas, snack bars, funeral parlors and mortuaries, and hotels, motels, and lodges.
All right, moving into parking. So the zoning code dictates how many off-street, on-property parking spaces are required as part of a development. So you can see in the photo below, yellow, what's shown in yellow here are those private parking spaces provided, but then what's shown in turquoise is on-street available public parking. And I do want to recognize that in Bellevue, there's a lot of head-in parking, so on-street parking availability is very limited. But currently what we do is we require a certain absolute number of spaces based on your different use. So for example, for retail or office, you have to have one space for 500 square feet of usable space, or for auto related services, one space for each 100 square feet of usable space. What we're proposing is around commercial uses is to really not look at any changes aside from updating and evaluating against industry standards. Are those ratios the best, like and most modern? Are they relatable to other uses in the valley or other communities? And then also look at updating our payment in lieu of parking fee. That's a fee where you could pay a lieu instead of providing the parking space, but that fee has not been updated in a very long time and is not actually reflective of the actual cost to build parking. And what we'd want to do to look at that is look at how do we make sure the costs are up to date, but then could we really leverage that funding towards more shared parking solutions like park and rides, maybe overnight parking options, more transit, more frequency, availability, and reach, and other multimodal solutions. So we could have more shared parking solutions instead of putting all of that cost into more single serving uses for single serving development. We also, though, recognize that fee can be inhibiting for a lot of those local serving needs. So how could we also maybe look to exemptions for community serving types of businesses that could be exempted from a fee like that? And then with residential units, we want to explore, instead of having an absolute requirement, do we take out the prescription of the town requiring you have to have this many spaces, instead of saying, knowing some people might have less cars, some people might have more, and really put it into your hands to say, you have to meet this minimum, but then you're going to decide how many parking spaces you want based on what's a market viable product. So the first draft of what's proposed is a minimum of one space for residential units across the town and no minimum for deed restricted units, but that's something we certainly want your feedback on.
And Mel, we had a clarifying question on this one too, related to the public on-street right-of-way parking and whether or not those are passed through to the sides of the building and not used on-street parking.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of like unique things going on in Bellevue in the area of the town, but generally anything available in the public right of way that's not like a driveway or something like that is on-street parking in the town right of way.
Mel, thanks for that clarification. And we can go into all of these questions and more as we get into the Q&A part. But given the amount of detail in this section, the Q&A function is a great place to be adding these questions. So thanks all.
Okay, as we start to move towards lot measurements, basically, as Mel mentioned earlier, we'd be removing the minimum lot size and minimum lot width, and then keeping the maximum lot area at 9375 as it is right now, which is a key that we use for the floor area ratio, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. Next slide, please. So as we look to setbacks, what's currently in place is on the left and what's proposed is on the right. Currently there's a front yard setback of 20 feet, and what we'd be doing, instead of having that 20 feet, it would change to have the 20 feet be a maximum with flexibility and parking encouraged off the rear. We'd be as Mel mentioned earlier as well, we'd be exploring sidewalk requirements within this zone district, and if those could be incorporated. For the side yard setbacks, there wouldn't be a change. Mechanical systems are one of our proposals is to allow those within the side yard setbacks, because we've been noticing with heat pumps, sometimes they are hard to fit within, the site gets tight. And so that's one thing we thought we could allow within the setbacks. And then there would be no change to the rear yard setback.
So in every zone within our code today, there's a section on additional provisions, which is essentially kind of a catch-all of different provisions that don't necessarily fit in those clear categories around land use density or fit. In the commercial zone, there is a specific provision saying that residential uses may not exceed 50% of the building area. And that's something that we want to look at exploring changing and allowing more than 50%, so long as commercial is maintained on the ground floor. And if that amount above 50% is used for the purposes of deed restricted housing. So maybe think of the examples here. Could there maybe be a third floor of additional housing that would maybe exceed 50% of the building footprint, but could be a possibility if it was for community serving housing.
Okay, so floor area ratio, or FAR, is the way to measure how much building can be constructed on a piece of land, and is the ratio in our town of the building's mass and as opposed to the lot size. So the C zone currently has a couple ranges for FAR based upon the size of the lot. These ranges are currently not used. Normally people aim for, the high end of the range, or try to fit on their parking and all the other things and then just land wherever they can. So this range is not proposed to be changing in what we're proposing for this zoning code update. However, we would evaluate the higher end of these ranges on the left side. So the 1.55 to 1.7, for instance, for a less than 3125 square foot lot, to say, could we somehow incentivize affordable housing or deed restricted commercial rather than just have that range that doesn't really function right now? We're evaluating the minimum unit size for a residential unit as well within this code update. Right now it's 400 square feet, and we're trying to determine what might be appropriate. We've had people throw around different numbers, whether it be the building code relation or 350 square feet. So that's one of the things up for discussion as well. And then regarding height, currently the maximum height exists at 35 feet within the C zone. This proposal for the zoning code change would be for the allowance of a fourth floor or height up to 48 feet, only in exchange for deed restricted commercial space or housing. The increased height, of course, would need to meet the design standard requirements and mass scale and form requirements for this zone district as part of that.
All right, so moving on to incentives. Right now, the code doesn't have a lot of incentives within our code of giving more flexibility or bonuses or things like that in the zone, aside from the plan unit development process, which provides opportunity for flexibility in exchange for public benefit, but it is a big process with a lot of oversight and decision making from BOZAR and our town council. We would still maintain that, but what we want to explore in this zone is looking at some embedded incentives within the code of saying, hey, we'll give you these things if you give if you give the community these things in exchange. So as Jesse mentioned, looking at the 4-story incentive with a design that still meets mass, scale, and form. So you could have that 4-story in exchange for a certain percentage of deed restricted commercial space and or housing. Could that be flexible? And the deed restricted commercial space is a new concept and something we're trying to explore of, is there some sort of avenue of a deed restricted space for commercial to say you have to have these limits on rent or these sort of parameters to try to really meet those local serving uses. And what we're doing right now is some market analysis around this incentive to identify, what would the actual cost be to build a development and the 4-story and all that, and what would be market feasible, what would the actual percentage that you'd have to require back be. So that is still an analysis that's being conducted. Additionally, to coincide with that, we would look at allowing the 50% residential limit. It also has an additional limit of no more than 2 units per parcel and a maximum of 600 square feet of size per unit, and really evaluate that and how does that coincide with the height incentive. So long as commercial is maintained on the ground floor to not preclude more housing opportunities within this zone, as long as it's for that community serving housing. And then lastly, really looking at updating our PUD process with the town council and BOZAR to improve the process, but also more clearly define required public benefits. The most recent example of a PUD was when we talked about in the B2 zone yesterday of the Academy Place parcel. And we hear a lot of feedback of the community really didn't get much out of that. There's the park and the pathway, and they did provide an extra affordable housing unit, but how do we just make that process so clear and those benefits so clearly defined and tied back to the community plan and the compass so that it's a really good process for everyone all around?
So the demolition ordinance that we currently have in place was put in place in 2019. And so that would be kept and strengthened, the language for that. And so specific to the residential construction, this requires if the building is approved for demolition or relocation and is less than the maximum FAR or floor area ratio, to reach the maximum FAR with that redevelopment plan, an accessory dwelling must be part of the redevelopment plan. There will be a section pertinent that pertains to buildings from the new period of significance. And then we're also looking at ways to create incentives for stabilization and maintenance for buildings within each period as well. Next slide. And so, as Mel mentioned earlier, we're just so excited to kick off the design standards update process as well. And that will start at BOZAR next week on November 18th at 5:30. We'd love it if you all could come and give us your feedback on your experience with the process and with the existing design guidelines, and how we can start this off with a bang. And so again, we'll be addressing the 3 areas that are outlined on the right here: the coal mining period of significance, the early recreation and ski era period of significance, and then outside of those 2 areas, within the design standards would be regulated by mass, scale, and form.
So that was a lot to digest, and we definitely want you to take your time to really ponder the considerations. On the town website, we do have a fact sheet with all of these different provisions of current and the first draft of proposed on there in document form, and we will share out this presentation. And then we have an open survey where you can really think about this first draft and give as specific or as general feedback as you'd like to give. But for now, I'll turn it over to Miles for Q&A.
Thanks, Mel. And just to reiterate, we'll follow up after this meeting with all of this information as well. But we've got some good questions coming in through the Q&A function for those who are just joining us. That button's at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can ask any questions that you'd like to. You can also find your virtual hand at the bottom of the Zoom tab. And if you want to ask a question, we'll unmute you and you can fire away. But meantime, just to follow up on some of the questions we have earlier, we've got the on-street parking question, and to add a little more clarity to that photo, along the curb, there's the public town right-of-way that exists that can be used for parking for, in those instances that was shown on the picture, the undeveloped lots have town right-of-way that's being utilized for parking. As those lots get developed and the developed lots we saw, that usually becomes the driveway where parking is no longer a use that takes place there because of the development. Mel, is that a fair clarification on the parking question?
Yeah, but we know that every neighborhood has their quirks and areas where people park and all that. So technically town right of way, but understand if it's maybe being used in a different way. I know it's also home to lots of couches around town too, this time of year in the right of way.
It goes back to that mixed use variety that that we have in the C zone. And then there's one more question from Mindy on the deed restricted market analysis that you mentioned. Will that be available to the public?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mindy. So right now we are anticipating a joint work session with the town council in Bozar on February 3rd to present those that analysis in all the different areas of town and solicit feedback on that. So that's publicly available, and the packet is also publicly available, which will outline and summarize that report as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Mel. And I do not see any new questions coming in on our Q&A function or any virtual hands going up. So we'll do a last call for questions, and we'll give one more plug to the survey that is live. Some of you may have even scanned that QR code there. You can get to it at the town's website from the community plan page, along with fact sheets for the C zone and all of the other zones. So you can look at the current and some of the proposed changes that are out there as they exist today, knowing that we are very early in the process. First drafts, early development that will be refined and redefined as we go through this process with you all. So I am not seeing any new questions coming in despite my filibustering. And I just want to make sure that we're answering everybody's question before we sign off here. And yeah, Mindy, I see your hand is up and you should be able to unmute. Hey, Mindy, we see your square and
Okay, there we go. I got it.
we
All right.
gotcha.
Hey, thanks. I just want to be really clear on the photos that are being used for additional street parking. I've brought this up in a few of the other meetings, and currently I'm looking at the Gunnison County website, and the representation there on Bellevue is the corner of 4th Street and Bellevue, if I've got the photo right, and the open space lot that's to the right is actually owned by Adaptive Sports, which owns the building to the left. And currently, from the Gunnison County website photo, they're using that as snow storage. And so, to represent that clearly as street parking, it seems like Adaptive Sports does use it for overflow parking for their recreation equipment, as well as their own other parking. So sometimes I've been seeing these slides come through that show that there's ample on-street parking that can be utilized as there's continued build out, but I still question the actual validity of that when I actually look at the maps and know these areas personally. So I just want to make a note here that these slides I don't know are really representative of what's available. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mindy. And didn't want to try to make the case that there's ample parking in all the different areas of town. I just wanted to show the difference between like private off-street parking and public right-of-way. But as I mentioned, I know Bellevue is really challenging and limited in parking because there's so much head-in parking and a lot of snow storage challenges too. So that's a great point that maybe it wasn't the best representative picture.
Minnie and Mel, thank you so much for those clarifications. And I think it's a common theme that we've heard in all of these webinars is really defining, public right of way versus some of the private lands are really important. And this feedback helps us make sure we're refining those things and those definitions as we're moving forward. And with that, I'm not seeing any additional questions or hands up. So Mel, I'll turn it back over for you for any final thoughts before we adjourn.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all so much for your time. Zoning's really complex, and we're really excited to work with you all on this update. And we would just ask if you have additional questions or feedback, please reach out to us. And if we're happy to come meet with you in your zone, at your property. We're happy to chat on the phone, grab coffee, or if you just want to share feedback in the survey, you all really know your zones really well. So just thank you for starting this process with us, and we really hope you'll stay engaged and work with us as we work through this.
Thanks, Mel, and thanks to all of you. Again, we are very early in this process. Be on the lookout for some follow-up materials that we'll be sending your way, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks all, and have a good night.
Thank you so much.